Hello, everyone. I'm Marion Huggins, one of the branch managers of the New Haven Free Public Library. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to another presentation with our partners at Yale Public Humanities. Tonight's talk is part of the Democracy in America series with Professor Matthew Jacobson. His guest this evening is Professor Elizabeth Hinton. She and Professor Jacobson will discuss Dr. Hinton's new book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. This book is available to take out from the New Haven Free Public Library. And without any further ado, welcome Dr. Hinton, and I'll turn things over to you, Dr. Jacobson.
Thank you so much, Marion. Always great to see you. Thanks not only to Marion Huggins, but our other partners over in the New Haven Free Public Library, Rory Mortarana, Luis Chavez-Bramel, Seth Godfrey, and Isaac Shub in particular. I also want to thank my colleague Karen Rothman in Public Humanities, who has done so much for this series, and also Jake Gagne, our administrator, who is working even now as we speak on the back end of the webinar. One program note, our next event will be December 7th with Mia Bay of University of Pennsylvania, who will be speaking about her important new book, Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance, a story of Jim Crow on the rails, roads, and airways. Truly one of the best books out there on Jim Crow, both North and South. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Elizabeth Hinton. Elizabeth took her PhD in history at Columbia and taught at the University of Michigan and Harvard before joining the faculty at Yale, where she currently teaches history and African American studies with a secondary appointment at Yale Law School. She's one of the nation's leading experts on race, criminalization, and policing. Her articles and op-eds can be found in the pages of the Journal of American History, the Journal of Urban History, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Boston Review, the Nation, and Time Magazine. She also co-edited The New Black History, revisiting the Second Reconstruction with the late Manning Marable. Her first book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, examines the implementation of federal law enforcement programs beginning in the mid-1960s that transformed domestic social policies and laid the groundwork for the expansion of the US prison system. Hinton presents Ronald Reagan's war on drugs not as a policy departure, but as a full realization of trends in surveillance and confinement that began during the Johnson administration. Tonight, we'll be hearing about her new book, America on Fire, a truly stunning excavation of patterns of violence and resistance that has somehow escaped full attention and reckoning, even despite the litany of incidents we can all recite, from Rodney King's Los Angeles to post-Katrina New Orleans, to Michael Brown's Ferguson, to George Floyd's Minneapolis. She's given us an extraordinary archive and an extraordinary instrument for understanding our recent history. So Elizabeth, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for that wonderful introduction. It's really just an honor to be here and be in conversation with you, Matthew.
It's great to see you as well. So I want to start with kind of a couple of big questions, and we can get into the weeds later, but I'm always, your book, I think, has so much to say about where we've been and where we are. So I wanted to just start kind of big. So something that I think not only historians have wrestled with, but as a society, we still haven't figured out the answer to the question, what is the post of post-civil rights? You know, any nation that can elect Barack Obama and then elect Donald Trump clearly has not settled itself on what the post-civil rights era is going to be or what it means. How do you think about that question?
Wow. So, I mean, I think one thing that we do know is that policing and incarceration have been the engine of social inequality post-civil rights. And I think that the post-civil rights society that we've been living in for at least the last 30 years is that of a mass incarceration society and all that that comes with that. A society that is deeply, deeply divided, and yet a society where, and this is something that comes up frequently throughout America on Fire, and that I really had to grapple with, that, on the one hand, We do have the, greater class equality. There are more Black Americans in the middle class, more people of color with college educations. On the surface, it's a seemingly kind of like more equitable, multicultural society. And yet racism is just as much, if not more, insidious because it is no longer, because public racism is no longer acceptable. And so in many ways, it's more difficult to actually pinpoint. And yet these same patterns, familiar patterns that have kind of defined the Black experience and the experience of racially marginalized groups throughout American history continue to reveal themselves. So I think, and mass incarceration and the policing apparatus really anchors that. We're now living in a society where systematically groups of disproportionately numbers of Black and brown people are locked up and warehoused. And this is, something that is historically distinct. And so for me, that's what this moment, that's what post-civil rights might be.
A lot of people, I think, don't know that the very first SWAT team that was ever deployed in the US was deployed against the Black Panthers in Los Angeles. And in those years after the Black Panthers and the more kind of militant Black politics emerged in the late 60s and then on into the 70s, it was very easy to see the militarization of policing as a political project that was being deployed against the civil rights movement. Can you kind of fill out that trajectory for us? Like, should we all be thinking of policing still as a political project? And has it been the same political project for the last 50 years? Or how do you think about that?
Oh, wow. Okay. So let me try to disentangle that question. I mean, I think when it comes to, so what's really important is that, so many of the strategies in COINTELPRO that were used against Black radicals and the radical left in general during the late 60s and early 70s were kind of rehearsals in some senses for the kind of tactics that would later then be deployed during the war on crime in the 70s and the war on drugs in the 1980s. So SWAT, which premiered in 1969 at the Black Panther headquarters, then becomes a kind of ubiquitous part of the drug war. Decoy squads and plainclothes operation and raids, especially like the raid that was recently depicted in the film Judas and the Black Messiah on Fred Hampton's home in association with the Chicago Black Panther Party. These tactics then become kind of part of everyday policing during the war on drugs. And, it's almost as if once, radical movements in the 60s had been effectively suppressed, that then, these policing tactics move on to something else. I mean, part of it too is the way, and I'm kind of just thinking out loud, but how in wars in general, and part of the story that I'm telling in both books, but particularly in America on Fire, is, what happens with all of the extra weapons that are being developed in Vietnam and interventions in Caribbean and Latin America that then become part of policing at home, policing the war on crime at home. Those weapons that were, and those strategies that were used against the radical left and Black radicals in particular, then become, part of the core strategies and methods that are used against civilians who aren't necessarily tied to political movements. But what's clear is that the expansion, the targeted expansion and militarization of police forces, during the second half of the 1960s and into the 1970s were about, the kind of twinned problems from the perspective of political and economic elites, the problem of continued Black rebellion and the problem that was, from their perspective, tied, which was the kind of growing militancy within the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And even though there's not evidence for this, there's not like clear, sustained evidence for this, and the Kerner Commission, said that the rebellions were not caused by outside influences. Law enforcement and policymakers from Lyndon Johnson on down were absolutely convinced that, or they told themselves that, the outside agitators, that communists, that the kind of Black Power radicals like Stokely Carmichael, were somehow actively involved and responsible for the violence. And so in their mind, the campaign to suppress any kind of dissent and political violence, whether that was kind of an organic community-based rebellion or an organized revolutionary action, was tied and was part of the same project, and and continued in the way that policing took shape in the 70s and into the 80s and beyond.
I'm really glad you mentioned the Kerner Commission report, because I wanted to bring that up too, in a couple of different ways. One is that one of the striking things about your book is that not entirely, but almost entirely, the many incidents of police violence and Black rebellion that you chronicle happen after that. So that document is written in response to the long hot summer of 1967. It comes out around the time of what was going to be another long hot summer of 1968. But you're writing about long hot summers for decades after that. So that was one of the things I wanted you to talk about. But another dimension of that, I mean, that commission report is it's kind of an astonishing document to read now, because in addition to what you just said about the outside agitator issue, this government commissioned document basically says that King was right, that rioting is actually the voice of the unheard, and that it's not just irrational, crazy behavior. It's in response to something that's very real. It's a kind of political expression. And I wonder how you think about where we are now in relation to the Kerner Commission report. Have we gone backwards in our kind of understanding of these kinds of events?
I love both these questions. So let me, I'm gonna kind of disentangle them and cover the kind of temporal question first. So this is something that was really surprising to me as I began this research. And that is the finding, I think one of the central findings of the book, that contrary to what the kind of traditional narrative about rebellion and even assumptions that I had in writing my first book, the traditional narrative is that they start in 64 in Harlem when a Black 15-year-old high school student is killed by NYPD. And then 67 is kind of this like the long hot summer with the unprecedented violence in Newark and Detroit. And then the kind of last hurrah of this form of protests are the hundreds some rebellions that emerged after Martin Luther King's assassination in April 1968. And so that's kind of what we assumed. And the archive that I was able to access showed that actually that was only the beginning of the rebellions, that, between 64 and including the Martin Luther King rebellions, there were about 300. But between the enactment of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 68, which was the kind of official launch of the war on crime at the federal level, in 1972, there were 1,949 separate uprisings. And they were in smaller cities. They were across the United States. They weren't, big northern cities that we typically think of as where this form of protest is occurring. And so that's really important. I mean, we can get into what I think that tells us about how people are responding to these new policing measures, but also a kind of a real turn that happens in civil rights protests that we haven't quite reckoned with, that happens after Martin Luther King's Jr.'s assassination. But the Kerner Commission, I mean, that is, and this is something too that I wasn't as sympathetic, I think, to the commission as I continued to research and write America on Fire, and in light of the 2020 protests, because the Kerner Commission is really this it is a missed opportunity in our history where we really could have gone another way. I mean, essentially, so for those who might not be familiar, Lyndon Johnson called the Kerner Commission in the middle of the unrest in Detroit in 67 to evaluate the causes of the rebellions and suggest a set of solutions. And the Kerner Commission, they work really hard for 6 months. They produce this like 500-page report that's a national bestseller. The famous lines are, the US, America's moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. And they really drew, or attempted to draw, the Johnson administration's and the public's attention to the role of white racism in perpetuating inequality and in sparking the rebellions, that it wasn't just about police encounters, or, it was really tied to these larger socioeconomic circumstances and conditions. And so they argued to the Johnson administration. They said, okay, if you're serious about ending rebellion, ending this violence in the future, because as you said, Matthew, they recognized that it was rooted in all of these socioeconomic causes, that it wasn't, contrary to dominant theories at the time, that it wasn't this kind of pathological thing, that wasn't about like, a carnival-esque celebration, or it wasn't, just a bunch of kids having fun, that it was actually political. And they said, okay, if the nation wants to address this, we've got to go well beyond the war on poverty, which was not, contrary to the lofty rhetoric of the program, was not a structural intervention, that we need a Marshall Plan essentially for American cities. We've got to mobilize the public and private sector to invest in job creation programs for low-income people of color. We need a complete overhaul of public schools, not remedial education, which was being offered under the war on poverty. And we need to completely transform public housing and create affordable housing in cities. And the Johnson administration was having none of it. And instead of the job creation program for low-income Americans of color, we get a job creation program for police through the crime war. And, we can only imagine where the US might be had those kind of investments been made. I mean, in the long term, and I think this is, this is what the body of both of my research has striven to show, is that, the decision to, instead of investing in schools and jobs and housing and healthcare and, food for people, investing in more police and more surveillance and more incarceration has not worked to keep vulnerable communities safe, and has, cost hundreds of billions of dollars in taxpayers' funds, and maybe the biggest, or at least one of the very biggest, domestic policy failures in the history of this country. And so, when we think about what the solutions to these enduring problems today are, I say we don't need another task force. You just go to the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission knew what we needed. We needed a different set of investments that were completely outside of law enforcement and crime control institutions, if we are really serious about safety, if we're really serious about building an equitable society.
Yeah. There's so much there. This is not a missed opportunity on the same scale as the Kerner Commission, but I wonder what you think of this. It seems like another kind of bump in the road in the post, like it's almost like a halfway point actually between where we are now and the Kerner Commission. There were two stories that were on the verge of becoming really major national conversations right before 9/11. One of them was mad cow disease, a phrase that you probably haven't heard since September 10th, right, 2001. But the other was the police violence in Cincinnati, especially, but also in Pittsburgh. And it was a big deal, and a big national deal, and it was becoming a bigger deal right before 9/11. And then 9/11 comes and not only chases stories like that off the front pages, but then it begins this new cycle of militarization of the domestic front. I wonder, is that actually a kind of weirdly lost opportunity also, or am I kind of overblowing what might have been possible in 2001?
I hadn't thought of it as I haven't thought of it like that. I mean, I do think that, well, if we think about LA in 92, which in some ways, and we think about I'm thinking about what might have been lost. The Rodney King beating that happened in March 91, the 92 rebellion in LA, of course, was in response to the acquittal of the 4 officers who were caught on tape savagely beating Rodney King, hitting him with their nightsticks and kicking him more than 60 times. This is the first kind of viral video of police brutality. And then you get really, the most unprecedented level of destruction during a rebellion in the history of the US and LA in 92, caused like over $1 billion in property damage in LA and tens of thousands of arrests. that had failed to start a new conversation about police brutality on a national scale, I think is indicative. I mean, what we get from the LA rebellion is, so we get the 94 crime bill, which of course vastly expanded police, with a $10 billion investment in 100,000 new cops in the streets of American City, another $10 billion in prison construction. But with that bill, one of the silver linings of that bill was a new power that was granted to the Justice Department called pattern or practice investigations, whereby DOJ officials could investigate and file consent decrees with police departments that were known to systematically deny people their constitutional rights. And so, that we in Cincinnati, I mean, part of why the police brutality there, in addition to the rebellion, but became part of a national conversation, is a result of that pattern or practice investigation. And really still, I mean, these pattern or practice investigations, you may remember that Biden, shortly after Chauvin's conviction, the Biden administration declared one in Minneapolis, and there's another one in Louisville, of course, where Breonna Taylor was murdered by plainclothes police under highly questionable circumstances. It's really the only tool that the federal government has to do anything about police departments that demonstrate, just massive abuse of constitutional protections and human rights violations. And yet, one of the things that I argue in my chapter in Cincinnati is that these still really fail to have, fundamental, meaningful change within and lasting change within police departments, because going back to my previous point, these problems are not rooted in police. These problems are rooted in conditions outside of police. Police are entrusted with managing the consequences of poverty and racial inequality by arresting people, by locking people up. And so if we're serious about looking for solutions, as the Kerner Commission said, I mean, that's the thing that's great about the Kerner Commission. It's not like, I'm not being pie in the sky. This was a presidential task force, a bipartisan, liberal leaning, but moderate presidential task force that came up with this more than 50 years ago. And so I don't know if given what we saw given the long-term response to both Rodney King and then the rebellion in 92 in LA, if that 2001, September 10, 2001 moment
Right.
would have been something different.
Right, because there was neither the will nor actually the instrument to yes. So you made reference to just the enormity of this archive that you've accessed, and just to give people a sense of this. In the single month of May 1969, there were 54 rebellions in the United States. Big cities, small towns, everything in between, every region of the country. Can you just characterize for us the range and the nature of these incidents that you found?
So first, I want to give a big shout out to Benjamin Schaefer, who helped me put together the timeline in the back of the book. And it's based on the data from the Lemberg archive that I used, which was a collection of newspaper clippings. The Lemberg Center for the Study of Violence started at Brandeis University shortly after JFK was assassinated, and researchers documented conflicts in American society. And, they collected local news accounts of everything from labor struggles to anti-war protests to student rebellions. And I just happened to go to the boxes and collect furiously digitize all the accounts I could from the local newspapers in the archive. And I was given access by a political scientist at Michigan, Christian Davenport, who had been working for some time with the archives on the quantitative side. And so he helped me kind of put this list together. One of the things, and it's a 25 plus page timeline that's included in the back of the book. It was really important to me and really exciting for me, especially as a historian, to be able to, I was glad the press let me do it with all those extra pages, to kind of make my data clear. I mean, I think in some ways the timeline makes the argument for me. I wanted everybody who reads the book to be able to see perhaps their hometown in there or a place that they lived, to really underscore the fact that this was a national phenomenon, and that this, I think one of the things that it really powerfully shows is that the Southern states, especially, engaged in political violence well into the 70s, which again, goes against our conventional narrative of the civil rights movement and Black militancy in general. Most of the, you'll see that most of the rebellions are single day affairs, although, several hundred did last for multiple days. These events were characterized by people who engaged in forms of political violence in groups of 5 or more. I mean, essentially, if the action warranted a newspaper account, because the quantitative alone is based on all these newspaper accounts, the event was relatively serious. And so, even this list is one that is incomplete and ongoing. And I think that there's, the papers that we used were all, again, from this Lemberg archive. So, there's definitely, as more of these papers become digitized, I hope that we'll be able to fill this out even more, and especially into the 1970s. I mean, I think one thing that is clear from the timeline and the kind of quantitative measurement of this is that, it really was like 68, 69, 68 after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So from summer of 68 on, that was kind of the peak moment where there were the most number of rebellions. And then by 72, they had started to trail off and began to approach their numbers in the mid to late 60s. So it is clear that rebellion did trail off in the 70s, but part of, why I'm limited to the 68-72 moment as what I call the crucible era has to do with the available data in the archives.
Right. So as you looked at it, does it turn out that, is it traffic stops, either kind of unfair or traffic stops gone awry, or police brutality, or the kind of, well, what we now call kind of broken windows, kind of harassment around low level issues? Is that usually the instigating event in these, or is it really varied?
So, of course, each rebellion is unique and has its own story and its own actors and its own specific causes. But one thing that was also somewhat surprising is that most of the rebellions were in response to the policing of ordinary everyday activities. So, like a group of kids hanging out on a street corner, and a police officer comes and maybe starts harassing them, or maybe tries to make an arrest, and then more kids come because they don't want to see their friend get arrested, and then the police officer retreats and calls for backup, and then it just kind of extends from there. It's what I call the cycle of police violence and Black rebellion. And then there's very frequently breaking up of parties and housing projects. Housing projects in schools were really, really important sites where rebellions frequently occurred. At schools, of course, after the Safe Streets Act in the late 60s, this is when we begin to get police officers taking a greater role in urban public schools, walking campuses more frequently, and with those more frequent contacts, you're more likely to end up having an incident that escalates. Very often, routine traffic stops, arrests. I mean, it's really the impact of the expansion of policing in targeted urban areas as a result of the war on crime, under the strategy that the best way to kind of prevent future crime is to initiate contact with what policymakers called potential criminals or potential delinquents. And the idea is really that anybody living in a low-income community of color is potentially criminal, is potentially delinquent, and so residents were treated as such. And their response to that treatment was to fight back. It's not, was not to take it, was not to say, oh, great, we wanted more police here. What people wanted were to get the, rats and roaches out of their apartments. And instead, they got more police. They got police becoming increasingly involved in urban social programs like public schools, like community centers, like after school programs. And the response was, I don't want my party to be stopped by you. These tactics certainly wouldn't happen in middle class and white communities, and people fought back.
Right. No, and this is it's the shocking. I mean, it's not surprising, but it's shocking that it's so obvious. If you pause over it for a minute, you realize that, sure, okay, if you send 50 cops into the Black projects with a brief to check out what youth are doing, and you send no police into the white suburbs with that kind of brief, you're going to get a bunch of arrests in the projects and no arrests in the, I mean, it's obvious that policing creates crime, not the other way around.
Right. And then, of course, those arrests then lend itself to rates of reported crime, because the crime rate is not measured by convictions, it's measured by arrests. Right. So then the justification is, oh, we need even more police in this area because it's a high crime area. And that's not to say that that crime isn't real, and certainly that social harm or violence isn't real, but that policing is, as you say, is implicated in that, and that in many ways these policing strategies, the cycles, are self-fulfilling prophecies.
Right. So, which is much of what your first book is devoted to. But so how is it that something that's so patently obvious does not make it into, I mean, certainly there are a lot of people saying it. You're saying it, our colleague Phil Goff is saying it, and Black Lives Matter movement is saying, I mean, there are a lot of people saying it, but it hasn't really quite made it into the bloodstream of our national discourse. And like, how do you understand that, and how do we crack that?
Yeah, so that's the hard question. And honestly, I've been really, in the year, has it been a year and a half since the 2020 protests, in watching the kind of long-term bipartisan policy responses, it's really maddening to me and really discouraging to me, because we're beginning to see, I talked about the policing cycle, but there is this policy backlash cycle of the response to both nonviolent and violent protests for racial justice and equal rights. The response ends up being more police. The response ends up being law enforcement is the only answer. The answer to people who are protesting police brutality is more police, and we're beginning to see that again. We're beginning to see that in the allocation of American Rescue Funds to expanding policing. I mean, the Biden administration has taken steps to expand police forces, and we're seeing that in the way that, at the state level and also in Congress, that liberal and Republican senators are have really kind of asserted that they are behind law enforcement, that defund the police is completely off the table, and so, despite the protests and these calls to say, no, we want a different kind of governance. We don't want local budgets, more than half of, city budgets, to be allocated toward law enforcement anymore. We, again, going back to the Kerner Commission, there are other ways that we can better promote public safety. And yet, like, police legitimacy remains this kind of like, indisposable guiding principle of domestic policy. And that's really frustrating to see. And so like, how do we shake that and building the political will for that? That's the question.
Yeah. I mean, it's as if, really, I mean, since the failed candidacy of Michael Dukakis in the late 80s, it's as if kind of soft on crime is to liberals as soft on communism was from 1947 up to that point.
Yep.
And so you get the crime bill under Clinton, and you get just, yes, many disappointing policies from places that you wouldn't necessarily expect them. I want to open it up for questions, please. Feel free to post questions to the Q&A. And I have a couple more myself, though. So while you're thinking of your questions and writing them down. So your book is divided into two parts, what you've called origins on the one hand and legacies on the other. Can you talk a little bit about what those two categories mean in terms of how you understand the trajectory that you're tracing here?
Yeah. So, you know, as I said, the crucible period in the late 60s and early 70s is really, you know, where our policing strategies kind of went wrong, or I guess our domestic policy strategies at large, that, you know, instead of those jobs and better schools and housing, people got these, you know, police officers in their communities walking around with M4 carbine rifles and armored tanks, and in many ways then the police in the post-civil rights era come to assume many of the previous functions of the white mob during Jim Crow. But there are really important differences between, you know, this kind of crucible era in the post-King moment and, you know, later in the 20th century, and, you know, the kind of big national rebellions that we see in Miami in 1980, in LA in 92, and Cincinnati in 2001. The earlier rebellions were, you know, as I said, in response to kind of everyday policing, as these new policing programs are being expanded. And not just, and I think this is the other like really important thing about this that I just want to say directly, you know, the fact that so many, that, you know, in this real kind of moment of the peak of rebellion, that so many of the rebellions happened in secondary cities really underscores, you know, the kind of impact of these new national strategies in places like Decatur, Illinois, or Stockton, California, or Waterloo, Iowa, where, you know, all of a sudden the police officers are getting all of these new goodies, or, you know, this weapon arsenal from the Department of Defense. So, you know, whereas in the post-civil rights period, the rebellions are in response to, you know, the kind of policing of the everyday. By the time we get to Miami in 1980 and beyond, and till today, you know, rebellions only emerge in response to these kind of exceptional moments of police brutality or miscarriages of justice. But like the earlier period, of course, you know, police are merely, you know, like in some ways the most tangible expressions of systemic racism in under-resourced communities, and these rebellions are too rooted in socioeconomic grievances and longstanding political and economic inequalities, and explode after a series of events that have failed to get communities any justice for these egregious acts of police brutality and violence.
Great. The questions are starting to roll in, and I'm really going to do my best to get to all of them. You mentioned Miami. I have a footnote on Miami that I'll add, but here's a question. I grew up in Miami. Throughout the years I was in high school, early to mid 1980s, there were these urban rebellions, riots. Our schools would suddenly be closed or we'd be sent home. How do you fit the 1980s into your schema or the developing narrative you present about the nature of uprisings and policing?
Yeah, so Miami is really interesting because the rebellion happens in 80, but then there's another one in 82 and another one in 89, and you know, again, reflecting the fact that the larger issues that the city had confronted, and that is the brutal way in which Black Miamians in particular were policed were not addressed, and the underlying issues behind them. I think the fact that so many of these rebellions happened, and really the big rebellions of the 80s happened in Miami, reflects its deep ties to as being kind of ground zero of the drug war. And I haven't completely teased all of this out, but especially in the mid to late 80s, there were major sting operations and all kinds of drug enforcement going on in Miami that led to mass arrests, and with that, like, just really kind of gross corruption on the part of law enforcement officials there. I wrote about this in my first book. But one of the craziest findings in the whole book that I wish people made a bigger deal out of is that in Broward County, the sheriff's deputies had seized a couple pounds of cocaine, and on the third floor of the county courthouse, they took that cocaine and manufactured their own crack to then go and sell in Black communities and then arrest people. So the sheriff's deputies made hundreds, if not thousands, of arrests for dealing their own drug. And this was the kind of policing that was happening there. And so it's not surprising that we get these exceptional moments of rebellion in the city.
Yeah, the footnote on Miami, I wanted to add, you and Ben Schaefer are probably the only other people on the call who know this, but there was a rebellion outside of the Republican National Convention in 1968. Everybody knows about the police riot in Chicago in 1968. Nobody knows about this rebellion outside of the Republican Convention. And one of the reasons is that the media just didn't cover it. And the other reason is that the Republicans completely ignored it.
Yeah.
But it's important. And there's a documentary film called Nixon's the One that covers that, and that has an amazing sequence on that rebellion. It's worth taking a look.
I'll definitely check it out.
More questions. Please comment on James Foreman's book, Locking Up Our Own. He says, I think, that Black urban political leaders helped bring along the mass incarceration phenomenon.
Yeah, so I think in many ways, my book is a great complement to his, because, and also thinking about like where we are in time, which matters, that, I think one of the big findings here is that the initial response on the part of many residents in the Black community, and I will say that, just like in the mainstream civil rights movement, pastors, civil rights leaders were very often not necessarily directly involved, but took the rebellions as opportunities to then make demands on city government. But I think, the sheer number of rebellions and those who participated in them really tell us that, that the grassroots response to expanded policing was, again, to fight back, was to say, no, this is not an acceptable state function in our community, especially when there are all these other grievances that we want addressed, having to do with housing and really having to do with jobs. How are you going to send the police in here when I don't have a job, when I have a college degree and I can't get a job? So, this, I think, adds another layer to that story of how of the diverse set of responses that Black communities engaged at different times to think about the role of policing and public safety in their communities.
Another question from the floor. Hi, I'm a student at Yale, and I'm curious what you believe Yale administration and Yale students' role should be in this discussion of funding redistribution away from policing, police brutality, et cetera.
Well, I think, one really important thing that we can do here is to think about, and, again, I think like thinking beyond police, like what can Yale do to better facilitate a more equitable distribution of resources in New Haven. I mean, as you probably know, Yale does not pay property taxes to New Haven, and essentially deprives it of millions and of tens of millions of dollars in a city that has major problems with its public schools, with joblessness. And so I think that, part of starting the conversation, and this is, I think one approach, given how, it seems as if like divesting resources from law enforcement in many places is off the table. So one way to think about how we might bring about a different approach to governance and to budgets is thinking, positively, like what are the things that Yale can do to contribute to the various things that drive inequality, to the kind of larger conditions that might lead to crime and social harm.
What do you say to the argument that eliminating stop and frisk in New York City caused a rise in crime?
What do I say to that argument? I mean, I just, that it doesn't make any sense to me. I think like we just don't, the crime rate in general and the way that these things are measured is is so difficult to actually understand what exactly is driving it. So yeah, I just stop and frisk, we know, and the Supreme Court ruled is highly unconstitutional. The things that we know drive crime or not, and again, stop and frisk is not something that necessarily makes communities safer. Stop and frisk leads to more arrests, leads to higher rates of incarceration. And so, it's very difficult to identify whether or not that specific police practice has an effect on rising crime.
Right. Well, and it's also, it's a symptom of just a kind of monumental failure of the white imagination to understand what it is like to live under a regime of stop and frisk. You hear white people say, well, if you have nothing to hide, why do you mind? Like, why do you care that you're getting stopped? The same people will say the same thing about Muslim travelers who are pulled out of TSA lines at an airport. If you're not a criminal, if you're not a terrorist, like why do you mind? And it's just the constant kind of harassment and surveillance that is just a total disruption of daily life. That's one piece of it, but it's also, as Veshla Weaver and others have argued, if interface with the police is really the only interface you have with the institutions of democracy, then your citizenship is just being totally disfigured.
Right.
Yeah.
I worked in college. I worked in New York City public school in the Lower East Side, and most of my students in the U.S. history classroom, and most of the students lived in the Lillian Wald housing projects there, and were Black and brown, and they would talk constantly about their experience getting stopped and frisked all the time. And it doesn't, we know that these things aren't necessarily crime deterrents. What they do is, as you say, is alienate people from government institutions and make them feel and set in motion a process of criminalization.
Yeah. Please continue sending in your questions, and I'll continue asking my own until you do. So Elizabeth, there are two different kinds of analytical power at work in this book of yours. I think one has to do with your vivid recounting of particular street level incidents or events. And the other has to do with just the staggering volume of materials in your vast gallery of atrocities and their patterns. Can you talk a little bit about how this archive educated you as you kind of worked your way through these two different levels, the kind of overarching patterns and the street level specificities? Because you came to this project knowing an awful lot, but I imagine that this was a real education.
Yeah, definitely. I think, one of the things that became really clear, and that took me a really long time to grapple with, was really seeing like what some of the shortcomings or the unfinished, how the unfinished promises of the civil rights movement were lived on the ground. because so many, and the press coverage varied, but it was just astonishing to me to see, in these thousands of pages, the patterns of like what people were saying, the demands that people were making, the kinds of tactics that police were using. But I think, really coming to terms with what King's death meant in terms of transitioning the civil rights movement, or the guiding principle, at least among young people, from being of nonviolent direct action to self-defense. I think the other thing that really surprised me, and I shouldn't have been surprised, but it's always surprising, is just the extent of white supremacist violence during this later period. And I wasn't necessarily prepared for that. And the extent to which this white supremacist violence was deeply entwined with law enforcement. I guess I didn't expect going in white supremacy, and especially the kind of the form that it had begun to take in the late 60s or early 70s, and that is like deeply tied to the political and economic establishment, and being practiced by prominent businessmen and local politicians. I hadn't quite expected that to figure so prominently in the story.
Mm-hmm. Was Trump in office when you started this work, or did you start when Obama was still in office?
So I accessed the archive at the very end of Obama's presidency in the summer of 2016.
Because I've just been struck that there was a period of, there were a couple of decades there where one might legitimately ask, like, what happened to all of the Wallace supporters who were here just a minute ago? Like, where did they go in the in the 80s and 90s? And now we know exactly where they went.
Yep.
And I just wondered kind of what your 20, 18, 19, and 20 experience of writing this history was, because it's I think it's easier to see the continuities now than it was even 10 years ago.
Yeah, and that actually might be in part why the white supremacy story surfaced for me so much more clearly, like really writing this up. So, I went to the archive in the summer, and then I began to write it up after the election, essentially. And most of the actual writing of America on Fire took place in 2020, and I didn't know what to do. I really struggled with what I was going to do with this archive. And, I wanted to give up. I sent an article that I had managed to draft up to a top history journal, which, basically gave me a really harsh revise and resubmit saying, these aren't political. And so after that, I was kind of like, well, I don't know what I'm gonna do with this. Maybe it's a graphic novel, maybe it's a chapter in another book. But then when the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protest happened, it just all kind of made sense. I mean, and of course, in the context of the pandemic, and in the context of the 2020 presidential contest, it was really, I have to write this up because this information needs to be out there. And so for me, it was really, it's been exciting to see this unfold. I feel like, and in that sense, I felt like, well, I have this, it was my responsibility, having been able to access this archive, which should have been made public years ago, but was kind of passed around by this group of political scientists. And if it had been made public, perhaps this history would have been, written into the canon years ago. But I just felt like I had a responsibility, given where we were, where we are, to share this, these sources and these stories with the world.
Yeah, no, as I said in my introduction, I think you've given us a really important instrument for thinking about our recent past, because these are things that were just really just completely under the radar, the mass of them. Like, so, people who grew up in Miami might know something about the Miami piece of it, but it isn't until now that we've been able to have a kind of bird's eye view of the whole country across these decades and what was happening. So you've performed a real service for us. This might seem like a non sequitur, but we do have 2 minutes left and I'm inclined to use them. There's so many just fascinating details that are embedded in this story that you're telling. One of them has to do with kind of the on the ground politics in post-rebellion Los Angeles. Can you talk a little bit about some of what you found there?
Yeah, so that's a really another, like that and the Kerner Commission is kind of the other missed opportunity. So you know, what emerged out of the LA rebellion that we don't talk about is this amazing truce that happens among warring sets of the Crips and Bloods and Watts, which of course had erupted in 1965, which was really the first like major rebellion in the first war or episode in the war on crime, as I say. But the Crips and Bloods came together and they said, okay, we want to stop. They finally were able to come up with a truce, and they said, okay, we're going to stop. You know, in the context of this rebellion, we're not going to, you know, shoot each other anymore. We're going to stop the community violence. We really want to change our community. They saw the rebellion as an opportunity to create a better Los Angeles and to address many of the larger problems that led to the rebellion and that they saw in their community that they themselves had created by sustaining violence there. And so they came up with this amazing, in the months after the rebellion, this amazing proposal as part of the larger rebuilding efforts. They, you know, had hoped that basically called for a $4 billion investment, which was essentially the budget that authorities in Los Angeles were working with to completely transform Los Angeles, to overhaul the public schools, to create police forces that were directed and staffed by residents themselves. Basically a job creation program. They said, look, you know, like we're running all these businesses in the informal economy. Give us an opportunity to participate in the formal economy, and we will. And the truth, despite the fact that authorities, you know, didn't make these investments or follow through with their demands, the truce lasted for a number of years and did lead to a significant decline in homicides in Los Angeles. But again, you know, like where would we be? Where would Los Angeles be had that kind of investment been made in South LA in '92?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time, which makes me very sad. I could talk to you for hours, and I'm sure everyone on the line could as well. But thanks for spending your time with us tonight, and thank you for the work you're doing. And this is really, it's been great talking to you.
It's been amazing. Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank all of you for coming and for your wonderful questions.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. I apologize. I missed a couple of your questions, but we got to most of them, and they'll be recorded, and maybe we can forward them to Elizabeth, and perhaps she'll get a chance to answer them. But in any case, everyone take care of yourselves. Don't let your guard down. We're still in a pandemic. Take good care. And I look forward to seeing you again in December with Mia Bay and her book, Traveling Black. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth.